Hi, I'm Madeleine Durand of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar of Brookings India in New Delhi spoke today at the Australian National University's National Security College Conference on Australia-Japan-US strategic cooperation. He is here with me to discuss India's regional security issues. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to start off by asking you about India and China's relationship. While most of the world is focused on China's role in the South China Sea, India faces Chinese encroachment on its northern border. What do you believe the security challenges are that India faces as a result of this?
Well, India's had a long history of contentious relations with China. There was a border war that was fought in 1962, which India was on the receiving end of. For China, this is not very well remembered. It's often victors of conflict don't tend to remember them as much as the losers of the conflict. And so in India, it still casts a much longer shadow. But on the other hand, the India-China border has been rather well managed by both sides. It's been perhaps India's most peaceful border. Nobody has been killed there since the 1970s. And so for 35 plus years, it's been a very well managed border. It is an undefined border, which is the problem. And so there are many areas which are actually gray zones. And that's where you sometimes have Indian and Chinese patrols overlapping and confronting each other. There have been a few instances of late also, roughly about once a year for the last few years, where Chinese forces have tried to change the facts on the ground by creating a post that was in one of these gray zones. And India's had to basically use diplomacy and other means to push back on it. But so there, it's a continuing issue. It's not a front order issue. I mean, it's a serious Indian national security concern, but it's not a live issue in the same way that the South China Sea is. But this is only one aspect of India's security concerns vis-a-vis China. I think we're increasingly seeing concerns about Chinese activity in the Indian Ocean, about China-Pakistan relations, particularly since some of the Chinese infrastructure projects go through territory that India disputes. And also, I think there are serious concerns about Chinese influence in what India sees as its neighborhood in places like Sri Lanka and Nepal and Bangladesh. And so for all of these reasons, I think China is a continuing strategic challenge for India. But they're also, like as with everybody else, there are important elements of cooperation between India and China. China is India's largest trade partner in terms of goods. So it is an important relationship. India and China cooperate on a lot of multilateral affairs, although there are some key differences as well. And so I think, like every country in the region, I think India is confronting opportunities and challenges and how to balance both with respect to China.
So further to these security issues, do you feel that India faces a problem with balancing against China in an economic sense? Is there any way that you believe India can leverage its large population and growing economy to rival China's regional influence?
So I think the short answer is yes and no, and I'll try to explain why briefly. If you look, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, India's per capita GDP was about the same as China's. It's not that long ago, it's 25 years ago or so, but there was a rough parity, at least economically, between India and China. Both were very low. In the intervening years, India's growth has been impressive. China's has been much more so, and so the Chinese economy today is about 4.5 to 5 times larger, depending on how you measure it, 4.5 to 5 times larger than the Indian economy. And per capita incomes are roughly about 4.5 times different. So I think India's starting off, or at this present juncture, India has a big disadvantage vis-a-vis China. It has a lot of catching up to do. The potential, though, is there. I think India has the potential to grow at a steady 7-8% for the foreseeable future, just because its base is much lower than China's, and China is going to have a different challenge, which is escaping the middle income trap, moving from a middle income country to a high income country. And so both countries confront these challenges. India, of course, has a much lower base. That being said, I think some of the comparisons between India and China are somewhat flawed, because for the simple reason that even if India had the same resources as China. I'm not sure it would be able to leverage them in the same way. India is not a single-party state. It has, it's a democracy. It has checks and balances. It has its economic decisions are subject to market forces, and so for those reasons, India will not be able to leverage its economic clout necessarily in the same way. India has other strengths, by the way. I think India does have strengths in terms of soft power, in terms of, you can see in terms of how threatening India's rise is to its neighbors relative to China. But I think in many other ways India will be at a disadvantage purely because it won't be able to marshal the resources in the same way the Chinese state has been able to do.
Yeah. Do you think there's the opportunity for the states to further cooperation, or do you believe that policies such as China's One Belt, One Road initiative and India's neighbourhood policy and Make in India campaign stand in opposition to one another?
I think there's some overlap, and I have written about this, which is I think economically there's some overlap. If Xi Jinping is serious about moving, to escaping the middle income trap and moving to a more consumer import-driven economy, then India is a natural partner. India can fill some of the gap. But on other areas, there's less overlap. I think on One Belt, One Road, I think apart from maybe in parts of Southeast Asia, there's not a lot. India sees this as a security concern in its own neighborhood. It sees it as a strategic initiative rather than a commercially driven one. So I think that's a concern. And I think in some neighborhood first. I think China has a sense, like all great powers, China has a sense of a realm of influence. As does India, and China's message to much of the rest of the world, and say in the South China Sea, is you respect our zone of influence, and India feels that the same. It is not like a reciprocal. There's not necessarily reciprocity on Beijing's part.
So I'd just like to ask you one final question. Pivoting from Asia to the US, how do you believe India will be affected under the new Trump administration?
So I think India is relatively well placed. There's some opportunities. There are going to be some challenges. The challenges, and we've seen this just in the last few days, will be in immigration. Will be a big issue. There's a big Indian American community. A lot of Indian temporary workers in the U.S., mostly high-skilled temporary workers in the U.S. So immigration, I think, is going to be a very tough issue. Bilateral. Economic relations as well. I think we'll see a tension between America first, Donald Trump's stated policy, and Make in India on the Indian side, in terms of sourcing, securing investments from multinational corporations. But on, I think, strategic affairs, there'll be a bit more, a shared. A meeting of the minds, if you will. We've already seen this in a few ways. I think India had some concerns about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, and so I think would have, even though Australians I know were quite, for good reason, unhappy with the US not ratifying it, India certainly will have welcomed it. I think India also welcomes some better relations between Washington and Moscow. Which again is something that President Trump would see, and then possibly, if this does happen, I think a more serious focus on a building up of the U.S. Navy, particularly the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, would also be welcomed, I think, in India. So I think so. Strategically, I think there's some opportunities for India. We've already seen them, but I think on bilateral relations, we'll see some complications.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. For more videos and interviews, please go to internationalaffairs.org.au or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.